Okay, so writing the speech is one thing, and learning it so that you don't have to read off your notes is another. But do you want to really take your delivery to the next level? There are strategies to refining your delivery that add an extra punch and leave a lasting, memorable impression on an audience. Speaking of impressions, let's start crafting your first impression so that your audience wants to hear more before you've even begun. Part of that first impression is the speech title. One of the best speech titles I've ever seen was How to Make a Baby in 6 to 8 Minutes. No. See, the speech was supposed to be a 6 to 8 minute speech to inform, and the topic of the speech was all about fertility treatments. Of course, that's not what we thought it was about. So the title alone had us all curious from the very beginning. One of the biggest parts of your first impression is your appearance. Think critically about what you're going to wear. Generally speaking, there's 2 rules that help you decide what to wear. First, if the way you dress is related to your topic, then go with that. For example, I'm not going to dress like this to give a speech all about how to change your oil. It would be far better if I showed up wearing greasy coveralls instead. Also, don't dress like this to give a speech all about yoga positions. It would make doing the downward dog really awkward and difficult. If you're not dressing for your topic, simply dress one level more formal than you expect your audience to be dressed. In other words, if you're giving a speech to typical college students wearing hoodies and jeans, then simply dress business professional, which is what you would probably wear going to a professional job interview. Your goal is to make yourself stand out as the focal point in the room. So think critically about how to do that, but dress comfortably as well. You don't want to feel restricted or so hot that you feel like you're going to pass out. The third part of your first impression is how you approach the front of the room. If someone has introduced you, then walk to the front of the room tall, confidently, and with good posture. When you get up front, take a deep breath and then launch into that sucker. Once you're in the speech, one of the best ways that you can connect with your audience and develop rapport with them is through eye contact. Neuroscience research tells us that our brains have an eye direction detector combined with a shared attention mechanism. Our brains are unbelievably good at being able to detect when eyes are locked with ours, and that helps to create what's called shared attention. When this happens, it makes us feel as though we're connecting with that person, and it releases all sorts of feel-good hormones. If I were to follow the age-old advice of looking at people's foreheads as I look around the room, then guess what? They notice. Like you probably just noticed when I was looking over the top of the camera. Nothing turns off an audience faster than somebody who refuses to look them in the eye. Look, you don't have to stare at people intensely in your speech.
There it is. Stare down. How long can you go?
Just try to look at everybody for at least 1 to 2 seconds at a time and try to make sure everybody gets even coverage. Unless, of course, you have an impossibly large audience, then just try to break up the room into sections. Okay, in the last video, I mentioned that we tend to speak a lot faster when we get nervous. The reason for this is tied to our heart rate. Our hearts regulate timing and rhythm for a lot of things in our lives. So it's no surprise that the rate that we speak is tied to this as well. When our heart rate climbs like a middle-aged dude on an elliptical, our rate of speaking also increases. The best thing we can do to help counteract this is to remember to breathe. In between your points, take deep cleansing breaths. This helps slow the heart rate and consequently the rate of speaking. Speaking of vocal quality, pay attention to all the various aspects of your voice. For example, there's a huge difference between volume and projection. Increasing your volume means you're shouting, while projecting means that you're filling the room with your voice. Also, think about modulating your pitch and intensity.
Nobody wants to listen to a monotone speaker, right?
Bueller. Bueller. Bueller.
So try to increase your intensity when you're trying to draw attention to a very important point. Or if you naturally speak with intensity, then try to draw it back in to make that important point. Another way of drawing attention to something is through strategic pauses. Silence can be incredibly powerful, and it doesn't take much. Short pauses add emphasis. And they're about a half a second to maybe 2 seconds long. Long pauses, about 3 to 4 seconds long, should be used sparingly because they're so powerful by creating tension in the room. By the way, don't ever use a long pause after you've asked a rhetorical question, because then guess what happens? You just answered my question, didn't you? That's what'll happen in real life as well. If you think using silence to manipulate your audience is devious, then wait till you hear about movement. A lot of us, when we first begin to learn about public speaking, forget that we have bodies. Story time. So there I was in Comm 101 as a freshman in college, and I had never given a speech in a classroom before. When I got up to the front of the room for my very first speech, my hands were shaking uncontrollably, and I thought everybody could see them. So I put my hands behind me, and I thought I was standing still. I got my speech video home, and as I was watching it, I noticed I wasn't standing still. I was rocking back and forth uncontrollably. So my instructor gave me this advice. She said, use movement as a way to offset those trembling hands. Hand gestures and walking around and whatnot are incredibly effective at trying to limit the effects of adrenaline on our limbs. So I got in there for my second speech. And in my mind, I was gesturing great, big gestures with my audience, and I was super dynamic and engaging until I got my video home and watched it. You see, my elbows were somehow mysteriously stuck to my sides, and as I was gesturing, I kind of looked like a T-Rex with these short, stubby little arms. That's when I learned to incorporate doing practice gestures at home. Also, consider practicing in front of a full-length mirror, so you don't unintentionally resurrect an extinct carnivore like I did. Practicing in front of a full-length mirror can not only help you develop much more natural and confident gestures, but it also helps desensitize you to eye contact. Believe me, if you can stare at yourself in a full-length mirror for the length of your entire speech, you can stare at anybody in any room. When thinking about your movement, make it intentional. The last thing you want to do is just pace back and forth throughout the room, because then that leads to distraction. To draw attention to a point, move toward your audience. If you want to make it extra powerful, move through your audience. As you close your speech, consider moving away from the audience and back to wherever you started. When transitioning to new material, consider transitioning from one side of the room to the other. This way, you're actually making a physical transition between main points. Also, a lot of speakers who choose to talk about potentially touching or very emotional topics suddenly discover a flood of emotion on speech day. When we're under stress and anxiety, it's like putting a magnifying glass over our emotions.
I'm in a glass case of emotion!
If your topic goes to an emotional place, expect the worst. That stated, if you do happen to choke up or tear up, just go with it. Don't stifle it, just push through. Your audience will respect you for it, and the vulnerability will add an element of power to your message. The last thing for us to cover, and the one thing that I urge everybody to do in their speeches at least once, is to include a wow factor. The wow factor is that one moment of profound brilliance that sticks with an audience days, weeks, or even months after the speech has concluded. There's a nearly infinite number of ways that you could accomplish a wow factor, but it should be unique to not only your message, but also your delivery style. Here's some examples I've seen in my teaching career. I once had a student give a speech on disaster preparedness, and he delivered the speech in full zombie costume and makeup. The whole point of his speech was, don't end up a zombie like me, be prepared. And it was absolutely stunning. Another student gave a speech on Tai Chi, and his attention getter was him doing a somersault under the table away from where he was seated. He got out into the middle of the room and began doing a full-on Tai Chi routine. For about 30 seconds, the room was completely silent except for his movement. That took guts. Sometimes speakers will split up stories, setting them up in the intro, dropping bits of them throughout the speech, and then saving the powerful conclusion for the very end. This is a great way to build suspense and use cliffhangers to help keep an audience listening. Also, a lot of students use powerful, unforgettable visual aids. Never underestimate the power of a well-timed image. That stated, the topic of our next video is visual aids. So in the meantime, keep practicing and see how many of these tips you can employ in your speech.